There is a particular kind of signal that does not announce itself with a press conference or a Truth Social post. It arrives quietly in the form of a personnel decision, and it carries more strategic information than any public statement ever could. When a government chooses who to send into a room, it is telling you exactly what kind of conversation it believes is happening, what language it thinks will be understood, and what outcome it considers worth pursuing. In international negotiations, the composition of a team is itself a message. It tells the other side how you have assessed the situation, what tools you believe are required, and how seriously you intend to compete. When you get the composition right, it changes the dynamic before a single word of negotiation has been spoken. When you get it wrong, you spend months speaking a language no one at the table is listening to. On February 15, 2026, Canada sent a signal of that kind to Washington. And if you know how to read it, the implications run considerably deeper than a routine diplomatic appointment. Mark Wiseman walked into the Canadian Embassy on Pennsylvania Avenue as the new ambassador of Canada to the United States on a Sunday. He was not a career diplomat, he was not a politician, he was not a former trade negotiator or a foreign affairs official who had worked his way through the ranks of Global Affairs Canada. He was something the government of Canada had never sent to Washington before in the history of the bilateral relationship. He was a capital markets professional, 30 years of private sector experience across the largest pension funds in North America, the most powerful asset management firm on the planet, and the elite corridors of mergers and acquisitions law in New York and Paris. He managed, at various points in his career, capital pools that most sovereign wealth funds would envy. And he arrived in Washington the week that the Supreme Court of the United States was preparing to deliver its verdict on the legality of the tariff regime that had been inflicting structural damage on the Canadian economy for the better part of a year. The timing was not accidental. Very little that Mark Carney does is. One day after Wiseman arrived on February 16th, Carney made a second appointment. Janice Charette, the former clerk of the Privy Council, the single most senior civil servant position in the Canadian government, was named Chief Trade Negotiator to the United States. Her title is Senior Advisor to both the Prime Minister and to Canada-US Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc. Together, Wiseman and Charette represent something I want to take you through carefully because the strategic logic behind this pairing is as deliberate as anything I have observed in North American statecraft in quite some time. It is a team assembled not to perform diplomacy for domestic audiences, but to actually conduct it. Let me start with what these two appointments tell you about how Canada reads the current state of the relationship, because that reading matters more than the names themselves. For the past 12 months, the dominant assumption in Washington has been that the trade confrontation with Canada is a political problem requiring political management. The administration deployed its tools accordingly. Tariffs were announced on Truth Social. Demands were escalated through press conferences. Deadlines were set and then shifted without explanation. The entire architecture of the pressure campaign was built around political theater, around the assumption that a neighbor sufficiently frightened by the spectacle of American displeasure would eventually send its politicians to negotiate concessions that American politicians could describe as victories. That model works when the other side plays the same game. It works less well when the other side sends people who do not speak the language of political theater at all, but who speak fluently a different language, the one actually spoken by the people who make decisions in the Trump administration. Consider who is on the American side of this negotiation. Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, spent decades at Cantor Fitzgerald, one of the most aggressive fixed-income trading firms on Wall Street. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, ran a macro hedge fund. Jameson Greer, the U.S. trade representative, is a trade lawyer by training, but the principals above him are financial professionals. These are people who think in terms of balance sheets, deal structures, risk premiums, and investment returns. When a Canadian diplomat who built her career in foreign affairs speaks to them in the language of international trade law and multilateral agreements, she is speaking accurately, but she may not be speaking in the register that moves these particular interlocutors. When Mark Wiseman walks into that room, something different happens. He is a peer. He sat on BlackRock's Global Investment Committee. He was talked about for a period as a potential successor to Larry Fink, the most powerful asset manager in the world. He spent 3 years at Sullivan & Cromwell in New York working on major cross-border transactions. He later chaired Lazard Canada, one of the premier advisory firms for exactly the kind of sovereign and corporate deal structures that the CUSMA renegotiation will ultimately require. He has a Yale Law degree and a Supreme Court of Canada clerkship. He knows how capital moves, where it comes from, and what conditions it requires to commit to a jurisdiction over a multi-year horizon. That profile is not incidental. It is the precise profile of someone who can sit across a table from Howard Lutnick or Scott Bessent and be treated as an institutional peer rather than a foreign government representative seeking favors. Peer relationships change negotiating dynamics in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. When a counterparty respects your professional credibility, they are more likely to engage seriously with your analytical arguments, to consider trade-offs that a purely political calculation would dismiss, and to look for agreement structures that both sides can defend to their own principles. Wiseman brings that credibility into the room in a way that a career diplomat, however skilled, simply cannot replicate in this particular environment. That is not a criticism of career diplomats. It is a description of the specific moment Canada finds itself in and of the specific decision that Carney made in choosing to match the environment rather than simply deploying the tools that worked in prior administrations. That analytical point is not decorative. It is the center of what the Kuzma negotiation is actually about, even if the political messaging obscures it. The United States Trade Representative has been publicly insisting that Canada must accept permanent tariffs as part of any deal and help reshore American industrial supply chains. That demand sounds like leverage. In reality, it is the statement of an objective that requires capital to accomplish. You cannot reshore a supply chain through a tariff. You can only do so if capital decides to build facilities, sign contracts, and commit to a jurisdiction over a planning horizon long enough to justify the investment. Capital is not loyal to tariff schedules. Capital is loyal to predictability and return. Mark Wiseman has spent 30 years managing the expectations, risk assessments, and decision frameworks of the institutions that control the capital the United States administration wants to attract. He understands from the inside how those decisions are actually made. That understanding is a diplomatic asset of a kind that cannot be replicated by even the most experienced foreign affairs professional. Now let me turn to Janice Charette, because her appointment is equally significant and for reasons that are distinct from Wiseman's financial background. The Clerk of the Privy Council is not a role that most people outside Canada understand intuitively. It is the head of the Canadian Public Service. It is the most senior non-elected position in the federal government, the position that sits at the apex of a bureaucratic structure employing hundreds of thousands of people and responsible for implementing every major policy decision the cabinet makes. The clerk serves as the deputy minister to the prime minister and as the secretary to the cabinet, which means she is the person who translates the decisions of elected leadership into the operational machinery of government. She knows where the leverage points are, where the constraints are genuine and where they are negotiable, and most importantly, she knows which commitments the government of Canada can actually keep and which ones are aspirational language dressed up as policy. Charette held that position twice, under two different prime ministers of different parties, Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau. That is a detail worth dwelling on. The fact that she served effectively under both a conservative and a liberal government tells you something about her reputation as a professional rather than a partisan actor. She is, in the precise sense of the word, an institutionalist. She understands how the Canadian government actually works from the inside, which means she understands what commitments Canada can credibly make, what constraints are real, and what political space exists to maneuver within. In a negotiation as complex as the Kuzma Review, that knowledge is invaluable. Greer has made clear that the United States wants changes to supply management, to Canadian cultural protection laws, to dairy market access, and to automotive rules of origin. Each of those issues touches a different set of domestic Canadian stakeholders, provincial jurisdictions, and legal frameworks. Navigating them requires someone who understands the internal machinery of Canadian governance at a granular level, not just the public positions of ministers. What Carney has constructed here is not a diplomatic team in the conventional sense. It is something closer to a deal team assembled with specific roles assigned to specific competencies. Wiseman provides the capital markets fluency and the personal relationships with the financial professionals who surround Trump. Charette provides the institutional depth and the governmental machinery expertise that allows Canada to make commitments with actual operational credibility. LeBlanc, as the minister responsible, provides the political accountability and the direct ministerial relationship with Greer that formal negotiations require. And Carney himself, with his background as Governor of the Bank of Canada and Governor of the Bank of England, two of the most significant central banking roles in the world, provides both the principal relationship with the Prime Minister's office and the strategic direction that ties the entire enterprise together. This is a government that speaks the language of institutions, of central banking, of long-term capital allocation, of macroeconomic risk management. It has assembled a negotiating team that reflects that language precisely and deliberately, matching its own institutional culture to the specific requirements of this particular counterparty and this particular moment. That kind of deliberate personnel design is not common in democratic governments, which typically staff positions based on political loyalty and bureaucratic hierarchy rather than functional fit. The fact that Carney has done it here tells you something about how seriously he takes the Kuzma negotiation and how clearly he understands what it will require to succeed. I want to be precise about what this means in contrast to what came before, because the contrast is analytically important and the distinction should not be read as a criticism of the person being replaced. Kirsten Hillman was, by every serious assessment, an exceptionally capable ambassador. She was a career trade negotiator who had been deeply involved in the original Kuzma negotiations that produced the deal in 2018. She understood the text of the agreement in granular technical detail. She had relationships throughout the U.S. trade and foreign policy bureaucracy built over years of careful engagement. She represented Canada with skill and consistency during one of the most volatile periods in the bilateral relationship since the Second World War. What she could not offer was the specific kind of peer credibility that the current administration's financial principles respond to. That was not a failure of capability. It was a feature of context. The context changed, and the requirements changed with it. Hillman's advice to her successor was notably candid and worth repeating precisely because it points towards something important about the nature of American power that professional diplomats often understand better than political analysts. She told the media that the new ambassador would need to get out of Washington, to engage with the country directly, to understand that America is a big place, and that its real power centers are not limited to the Beltway and the State Department briefing rooms. That advice reflects something true about how influence is built and maintained over time in the United States. It is not built in formal diplomatic channels alone. It is built in boardrooms in Houston and Dallas and Atlanta, in conversations with governors and senators and the business leaders who fund their campaigns and shape their thinking on economic policy. It is built through the kind of relationship capital that takes years to accumulate through repeated professional interaction. Wiseman, with his decades of institutional investor relationships across both the American and Canadian financial landscapes, has exactly that kind of relationship capital already in place. He does not need to start building it, he arrives with it. There is also a signal embedded in these appointments that extends beyond the immediate negotiation, and it speaks to how Canada is positioning itself for the period after the current confrontation resolves, however it resolves. The Kuzma review is not the only thing at stake. The Section 122 tariffs that replaced the IEEPA duties following the Supreme Court ruling will expire on July 24, 2026, unless Congress votes to extend them. That creates a window of pressure that the administration will want to use. Simultaneously, the mandatory Kuzma review is triggered on July 1st, with governments required to submit recommended changes by June 1st. Two major deadlines, separated by 23 days, are converging on a single negotiating moment in the late spring and early summer of this year. The composition of Canada's team signals that Ottawa understands the compressed timeline and has positioned itself accordingly. This is not a diplomatic holding pattern. It is a deal team assembled with a specific transactional objective and a specific deadline. What concerns me most about the American side of this dynamic is not the strength of its negotiating position, but its apparent failure to recognize what the composition of the Canadian team is signaling. The administration has continued to speak publicly in the language of demands, of tariff acceptance as a precondition for any agreement, of supply chain reshoring as an American entitlement rather than a mutual investment opportunity. That rhetorical posture may play well in a State of the Union address, but it does not move capital. Capital moves when the risk-adjusted return on a long-term commitment is favorable, when the regulatory environment is predictable, when the political signals point toward stability rather than escalation. Canada is offering those conditions. The question is whether the people negotiating on the American side understand how to translate the stated political objectives into an actual industrial policy that can attract the capital required to accomplish them, or whether they will continue to confuse tariff pressure with industrial strategy. Wiseman's career history contains an instructive detail in this regard. Before joining CPPIB, he was a law clerk at the Supreme Court of Canada under Justice Beverly McLachlin, who later became Chief Justice. He then spent 3 years at Sullivan and Cromwell in New York and Paris, working on cross-border transactions at the highest level of corporate law. He came back to Canada and spent over a decade building the CPPIB from a relatively passive vehicle into one of the world's most sophisticated institutional investors, diversifying away from domestic Canadian assets into global infrastructure, private equity, and real estate. The investment philosophy he developed at CPPIB, and that he later brought to his other roles, was built around a concept he co-founded called focusing capital on the long term. The core idea is that institutional investors, and by extension the corporate and governmental actors they engage with, systematically underinvest in long-duration assets because their incentive structures reward short-term performance. The same analysis applies to trade policy. A tariff imposed for 90 days or a Section 122 surcharge that expires in 150 days is not an industrial policy. It is a short-term pressure instrument. Industrial renewal requires decade-long commitments to infrastructure, workforce development, and regulatory stability. Wiseman has spent his entire career thinking about the gap between short-term price signals and long-term value creation. He is unusually well equipped to explain that gap to a counterparty whose trade policy has been characterized almost entirely by short-term pressure tactics. I have spent a great deal of time over the past year analyzing the strategic choices that Canada has made in this confrontation. What strikes me most consistently is the degree to which those choices have been institutionally coherent. The diversification toward Asia, Europe, and Latin America is not theater. The China agricultural deal, for all the criticism it attracted in Washington, reflects a serious assessment of where long-term market growth lies for Canadian commodity exporters. The internal trade liberalization law that came into force in January of this year, eliminating what economists estimated to be a 7% hidden tariff on interprovincial commerce, is a genuine structural reform that strengthens the domestic economic foundation on which trade diversification depends. The appointment of Wiseman and Charette fits the same pattern. It is not a symbolic gesture toward strength. It is a calibrated deployment of specific capabilities matched to the specific demands of a specific negotiating context. The broader lesson here, for those who follow how power actually operates in modern economic relationships, is that institutional depth is not glamorous, but it is durable. What Canada is sending to Washington is not a politician who can generate a viral moment or a diplomat who can deliver an eloquent statement of principles. It is a team that can build a durable agreement under compressed time pressure, with a counterparty whose behavior has been consistently unpredictable and whose stated objectives have shifted multiple times over the course of 14 months. Those are different objectives that require different capabilities, different temperaments, and different professional backgrounds. The team Carney has assembled matches those requirements in a way that reflects careful thought rather than political calculation. The question of which objective will ultimately shape the outcome of the CUSMA review will tell us a great deal about whether the current American approach to trade policy is a strategic framework or a performance. History has a way of being clear about which of those two things produces lasting results. It is almost never the performance.